Now, before faith came, we were imprisoned and guarded under the law until faith would be revealed. Therefore, the law was our disciplinarian until Christ came, so that we might be justified by faith. But now that faith has come, we are no longer subject to a disciplinarian. For in Christ Jesus, you are all children of God through faith. As many of you were baptized into Christ, have clothed yourselves with Christ. There is no longer Jew or Greek. There is no longer slave or free. There is no longer male or female. For all of you are one in Christ Jesus. And if you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's offspring, heirs according to the promise. The word of the Lord. Summer. For me and for those of you who are teachers, or the other teachers around, it's a few weeks that we get to decompress a little bit. With the constant demands on our time and the endless problems that we face during the school year, it just diminishes just a little bit, and we get a chance to slow down and enjoy the moment. So one day this week, I was going to walk my dog one morning. Now, he's an old dog, and he has trouble walking. So you have to be really patient with him. Walks take a long time. And he's blind in one eye, and he can't see out the other. And I don't know if he's deaf or not, or if he's just ignoring me. But this morning, we headed out, and I told him, his name is Louis. I said, Louis, it's summer. We're going to take an even slower pace today. I said, when we go outside, let's see if we can hear some birds. We walked outside, and we tried. There were a lot of bugs making noises. And I don't know what they are, they're crickets or grasshoppers or whatever, but the air was full of that chirping. And then in the distance, I heard a lawnmower. Somebody had a lawnmower going. And then overhead, there was a small plane flying over. But then I heard it. It said, there was a bird. I could hear it. And I turned to Louis. I said, Louis, you hear the bird? And he acted like he didn't care. Trying to hear the birds was hard when there are so many other things that I could listen to that were drowning out their sound. And it made me think that that's how life is. There are moments in life when we get overwhelmed by all of the stuff going on around us, when there's too much going on. Maybe even the people we're closest to seem to be so busy that it seems like they've turned against us. And maybe sometimes our faith feels a little worn thin. In those moments, what we long for the most is a word from God, a sign, a voice, a direction. But what happens when we can't hear that because of all the other noise going on? Or maybe all we hear is silence. Well, today we read part of a story from the prophet Elijah. At this point, he's at the height of his power. He's not at the height of his power. He's at the depth of his despair. And after this bold confrontation with the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel, a great triumph of faith, you might expect Elijah to bask in divine favor and public gratitude. Instead, he's threatened, he's pursued, and he is left utterly alone. Exhausted, he flees into the wilderness, and he pleads with God for death. This is not the picture of a confident prophet. This is a man who has given up. And yet, it's in this wilderness, both physical and spiritual, that something holy begins to stir. It's not in the blaze of a fire or in the thunder of an earthquake, but in something gentler, something quieter, something that can only be heard if one slows down, waits, and truly listens. I remember a story told me by a retired minister. He was visiting a small rural church after his retirement. He liked being able to go into a church and sit in the back pew and be present for worship but not have to lead. And this congregation was small. It had dwindled over the years. The organ creaked more than it played. The choir was made up of 3 faithful women and 1 out-of-tune tenor. The preaching was fine, humble, and the building was in disrepair. But every Sunday, they gathered there with open hearts. One day, a young man dropped by there, a stranger to all of them, and he said, I was driving by and something told me to stop. And the minister was intrigued and asked him to explain a little more what brought him inside. And the young man couldn't quite explain it. He said, I just felt that I needed to be here. And when I came inside, I felt peace, like I was home. There had been no great sermon that drew him in, no dramatic altar call, just the simple faithfulness of people listening for God. And somehow, God had spoken through that. Elijah had expected God to speak to him as he had on Mount Carmel, with fire coming down from the heavens and mighty works. And who could blame him? That's what made sense. That's what matched the image he had of God's power. But now he stands on another mountain, waiting. And the familiar signs pass by. Wind, earthquake, fire. And God is not in them. Instead, Elijah hears something else, a quietness, a whisper, a stillness. The passage describes it as a sound of sheer silence. What a paradox, a sound of silence. It's the kind of moment that invites discernment, not reaction. It's a moment that demands our full attention. So often in our lives, we look for clarity. We want God to shout instructions. We want certainty. But more often than not, God whispers. And that whisper may come in the most unexpected places. A kind word from a stranger, a sudden feeling of calm in the middle of an anxious moment, a line from a hymn that pops into your mind, a conversation when something deeper is revealed. As theologian Dallas Willard once said, God will not compete for your attention. If you want to hear his voice, you must turn down the volume of the world. But the challenge, as always, is not just to hear, but to discern. We live in a noisy world. There are voices everywhere. Political voices, social voices, voices of fear, voices of ambition, voices that tell us who we should be, what we should want, who we should fear. And in the midst of all that, how can we hear the voice of the Lord? Discernment is not about decoding some mystical secret. It's about learning to listen with a faithful heart. It begins with prayer. It involves reading scriptures. Not as a rule book, but as a window into the character of God. It includes the a community of faith. Not just the loudest voices, but the gentle wisdom of those who have walked the road before us. Sometimes God speaks through a challenge that we can't ignore. Sometimes God speaks to us through a burden we can no longer carry on our own. Sometimes God speaks to us through a question that keeps returning to us over and over. And sometimes God speaks to us by saying, "Be still, I am here." When Elijah heard that silence, he wrapped his face in his cloak because he knew something holy was near. But even then, God did not offer answers, only a question. What are you doing here? And that's the same question God asks us. Not to shame us, but to reorient us, to remind us of our calling, bring us back from despair. What are you doing here? God gives Elijah a new direction, not to return to Carmel, not to fight again, but to move forward, to anoint new leaders, to pass the mantle on to them, and then to take the next faithful step. The whisper of God may not always come with clarity, but it always comes with grace. God speaks not to command, but to companion, not to direct, but to dwell with us. When you find yourself in the wilderness, emotionally, spiritually, physically, take time and listen. Not for the spectacular, but for the subtle, for the whisper, for the stillness, for the presence that meets us not in triumph, but in vulnerability. And when you hear it, be in awe, because the living God is not far off. The living God is close enough to whisper.